Africa's position in the global mineral economy has moved from strategic importance to structural dominance. Over the last 2 decades, demand for minerals critical to modern industry has expanded at a pace unseen since the Industrial Revolution. Electrification, digitalization, urbanization, defense manufacturing, and the global energy transition have dramatically reshaped what resources matter most. At the center of this shift sits Africa, a continent that holds a disproportionate share of the world's most essential minerals, many of which are foundational to a market now valued in the trillions of dollars. Copper, cobalt, lithium, manganese, platinum, chromium, bauxite, rare earth elements, graphite, uranium, gold, and iron ore form the backbone of global industrial systems. Africa controls significant reserves of nearly all of these materials. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone accounts for over 70% of global cobalt production. Zambia is a top copper supplier. South Africa dominates platinum group metals. Guinea holds some of the world's largest bauxite reserves. Zimbabwe and Namibia are emerging lithium centers. Mozambique has become a critical graphite supplier. Niger and Namibia are central to uranium supply. When these resources are combined, Africa's role is no longer marginal or supportive. It is decisive. The estimated $2 trillion valuation attached to critical minerals reflects not just current trade, but projected demand across the next several decades. Electric vehicles require multiple times more mineral inputs than traditional vehicles. Renewable energy systems rely heavily on copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. Data centers, artificial intelligence infrastructure, military systems, aerospace manufacturing, and telecommunications networks all depend on stable access to these materials. As demand accelerates, control over supply becomes power. For decades, Africa's mineral wealth was extracted under arrangements that left limited value on the continent. Raw materials were exported, refined elsewhere, and sold back at higher value. That model is now under pressure. African governments are increasingly aware that global dependency on their minerals gives them leverage. Policy frameworks are evolving toward value addition, local processing, higher royalties, stricter environmental oversight, and renegotiation of long-standing contracts. These changes do not represent sudden takeovers. They represent a gradual rebalancing of power. Global markets have responded to this shift with heightened sensitivity. Mineral prices increasingly react not only to production volumes, but to regulatory signals from African capitals. A proposed royalty change in Zambia, a new export rule in Indonesia that influences comparative markets, a processing requirement in the DRC, or a licensing review in South Africa can move prices within hours. This responsiveness reflects how tightly global supply chains are now tied to African policy decisions. The United States, Europe, China, and emerging industrial powers all face the same reality. Alternative sources for many critical minerals are limited, costly, or politically constrained. New mines take years or decades to develop. Environmental opposition, permitting delays, and capital intensity restrict rapid expansion outside Africa. Recycling can help, but it cannot meet near-term demand. Strategic stockpiles are limited. This structural imbalance shifts bargaining power toward resource holders. China recognized this reality earlier than most. Through long-term investment, infrastructure financing, and refining capacity development, China positioned itself as the dominant processor of African minerals. Even when minerals originate in Africa, much of the downstream value has historically accrued elsewhere. African governments are now pushing back against this pattern, seeking to retain more stages of the value chain domestically or regionally. Smelting, refining, battery precursor manufacturing, and component assembly are increasingly central to national development plans. The African Continental Free Trade Area has accelerated this thinking. By reducing internal trade barriers, African nations can coordinate mineral processing and manufacturing across borders. Copper mined in Zambia can be processed regionally. Lithium from Zimbabwe can feed battery supply chains serving multiple countries. Platinum from South Africa can anchor hydrogen and fuel cell industries across the continent. These developments strengthen Africa's collective market position and reduce reliance on external intermediaries. The notion that Africa is taking over the mineral market reflects a deeper truth about leverage rather than ownership. Africa does not need to control global exchanges or set prices unilaterally to shape outcomes. By controlling access to supply, setting regulatory conditions, and coordinating development strategies, African nations exert influence over a market whose value is driven by scarcity and demand growth. This influence is amplified by the absence of easy substitutes for many minerals. Western economies are increasingly aware of this dependency. Policy documents in the United States and European Union now openly describe critical minerals as national security priorities. Governments have launched initiatives to diversify supply chains, form strategic partnerships, and support domestic mining. However, these efforts face practical limitations. Even with aggressive investment, it will take many years before alternative supply sources materially reduce reliance on African minerals. The transition to clean energy further deepens this reliance. Wind turbines require large quantities of copper and rare earths. Solar installations depend on silver, copper, and silicon-related inputs. Grid-scale energy storage depends on lithium, cobalt, and manganese. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure multiplies copper demand. Every decarbonization pathway modeled by international agencies assumes stable access to minerals that Africa supplies in abundance. Africa's growing assertiveness in mineral governance is not uniform across the continent, but the trend is clear. Governments are strengthening mining codes, improving contract transparency, and linking mineral extraction to broader development goals. Revenue from minerals is increasingly framed as a tool for infrastructure development, education, healthcare, and industrial diversification. Public opinion within many African countries now strongly supports retaining greater control over natural resources. This shift has introduced new complexities for multinational mining companies. Firms must navigate evolving regulatory environments, increased scrutiny, and rising expectations for local participation. While many companies remain committed to operating in Africa due to geological advantages, profit models are adjusting. Higher costs are increasingly accepted as the price of access. These costs ultimately feed into global prices, reinforcing the high valuation of the mineral market. Financial markets have adjusted accordingly. Investors increasingly view African mineral assets as strategic rather than speculative. Long-term capital is flowing into projects that secure access rather than maximize short-term returns. Sovereign wealth funds, state-backed lenders, and industrial consortia are competing for stakes in African mining and processing ventures. This competition further elevates the continent's bargaining power. The $2 trillion figure associated with the mineral market reflects cumulative value across extraction, processing, manufacturing, and future demand projections. Africa's role spans all these layers. While not every stage is yet localized, control over the foundational input confers influence over the entire chain. In economic terms, upstream dominance shapes downstream outcomes. The implications extend beyond economics. Minerals increasingly shape geopolitics. Countries with secure access gain strategic advantages in defense, technology, and energy independence. Countries without access face vulnerabilities. Africa's mineral endowment therefore translates into geopolitical relevance. Diplomatic engagement with African nations has intensified as global powers seek long-term supply assurances. Africa's internal challenges remain real. Infrastructure gaps, governance issues, environmental concerns, and social impacts of mining must be managed carefully. However, these challenges coexist with unprecedented opportunity. The global system now needs Africa's minerals more than Africa needs any single external peer. This asymmetry marks a historic shift. The narrative of takeover is therefore symbolic rather than literal. Africa has not seized control through confrontation, but through structural necessity. The world's economic trajectory has elevated minerals that Africa happens to hold in abundance. As demand rises and alternatives remain scarce, influence flows naturally toward the source. This reality is reshaping investment strategies, foreign policy priorities, and industrial planning worldwide. Africa's mineral wealth is no longer viewed as a passive resource pool, but as an active driver of global economic outcomes. Decisions made in African capitals increasingly ripple through markets in New York, Shanghai, London, and Brussels. As the next decades unfold, Africa's choices will help determine the pace and direction of technological advancement, energy transition, and industrial growth. The continent's role in the mineral economy is not a temporary moment, but a defining feature of the 21st century global system. The scale of the market, the centrality of the resources, and the inevitability of demand growth together explain why Africa now sits at the center of a mineral economy valued in the trillions.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.